I'm Mikaela from the growth team at Codebots, and today we're going to be looking at the top 10 risks of software development. So risks are apparent in every project. The important thing is to learn how to recognise them and effectively manage them. The top 10 risks we identified, and that's based on our own experience and partner experiences, are inaccurate estimations, scope variations, end user engagement, stakeholder expectations, poor quality code, poor productivity, inadequate human resources, low stakeholder engagement, inadequate risk management, and lack of ownership around the product. To find out more on these risks, we spoke to some experts in the area. The first people we spoke to were from our friends at Jumar Solutions in the UK, and we spoke to the CEO, Wendy and the CTO, Adrian Sutherland. We also spoke to Leesa, who's an expert in a number of areas of tech. She's got experience as a VC in particular and a Chief Innovation Officer. We also spoke to Sendall, who's based over in the Netherlands, and he is an experienced product manager. From our experience, inaccurate estimations are a particular risk in software projects and can cause a severe impact on the project if it does happen. So how do you accurately estimate the software? We've come up with a number of strategies for us to help mitigate this particular risk. And that includes elaborating only on the work that has immediate priority, including tech specs in your estimations, which is like an allocation of time for developers to research and de-risk a particular complex or unfamiliar part of the project.
You look at, okay, where do we want to get to? And then you sort of work backwards from there. So we often talk about that in terms of planning and stuff, but you can do the same with risk. So, okay, we want to get to this end state. That's the outcome we're looking for. Okay, to get there, how would we have got there, right? And sort of then you tend to work back.
People talk about the 80-20 rule. Doing the 80% is quite easy, and people find that the last 20% of the project takes twice as long as everything else that you've done so far. And that's because the devil's in the detail when it comes to software development.
We engaged with a third-party supplier to actually deliver on a project for us. So we engaged with the customer, and that project did go through to the end, but we had underestimated some of the work that needed to be completed, and we didn't ask detailed enough questions about what it was that they were looking to achieve with what we were doing. So that's probably quite a good example of how not to do a project.
We also add an allocation factor to the estimations, which is basically a period of time that people have to spend on meetings and other external factors that aren't directly spent on the project. Scope variation creates a severe risk to projects. When it occurs, it can create a significant impact on the ability for developers to stick to the original timeline of projects.
My number one is always scope. Yeah. So Evan is absolutely right. We've lost millions of dollars in companies on scope, where the client constantly has scope creep. And the reason why we have that problem is generally because we don't have project governance around requirements and execution of deliverables.
Some valuable strategies for helping to mitigate scope variations are short, manageable iterations. This means like using the agile methodology to allow for more frequent opportunities to reflect upon the project scope, as well as elaborating any of the prioritized work.
I think we also need to talk about which of those additional requirements are must-haves versus nice-to-haves. Because why will we invest all this time, money, and energy if they're nice-to-haves and they're not must-haves? And those requirements priorities have to come from the business. So we need to have had at least 3 conversations in the business, because, in statistics, 3 is good, any less is bad. So we want to have governance points of at least 3 individuals who are users of the software that determine what is priority and what is nice to have.
The risk of end user engagement is when the product is released to market, but the users are resistant to the change that the product creates. Some possible mitigations for the risk include user testing and surveys, having focus groups, and having frequent releases of the product.
So user adoption is fundamental. And how do I analyze user adoption? How many users have logged in the last 30 days? And based on the number of users that have logged in, of the whole number of users, how much time did they spend in the system? And is that level of time for that functionality normal.
So how do you set expectations with stakeholders? From our experience, here are some of the key considerations that you can take. Effective communication. Obtain frequent approval and acknowledgement of the project from all the relevant stakeholders. Follow tested development methodologies, such as our way of working. Involve stakeholders in all important meetings and ensure stakeholders maintain reasonable response lines for communication with development teams.
One of the areas of risk is getting those requirements clear to the level which is appropriate for the stage that the project's in, and managing expectations around what is the art of the possible.
The risk of poor quality code can occur for a number of reasons, in particular when projects are underestimated and developers rush to complete the iteration.
Often you're starting a new project, so it's new people who haven't necessarily worked together, making sure that they are working to the same standards, making sure that they all, the architecture is agreed and appropriate and sort of industry standard, making sure that when people are cutting code, it's of the required quality. We've got the right processes in place, the right templates are being used. So it's really that kind of making sure that we start from the get-go with a very clear expectation of what the developers should be doing and what tools they should be using and how they should be coding, and making sure that everyone's working to the same style.
Almost always, and be very strange to not have to learn something to be able to deliver the solution that we need. So there's those knowledge gaps. So can we look a little bit ahead and say, oh, well, we probably need someone to upskill in this area, and not just necessarily from skills point of view, but also in, de-risking things.
Some of the following strategies can be used to improve the risk of poor quality code. Implementing user acceptance criteria to have stakeholders affirm the project is up to standard. Code reviews, clear coding standards and guides, testing of all code, and appointing a dedicated product manager to monitor the quality of the project and take ownership to all stakeholders for the success and failure. So when a project group may fall behind on development timeframes, you might need to examine the productivity of the development team. It's valuable to consider some of the following strategies when looking at poor productivity. The people culture of your company, setting achievable timeframes and sustainable pace during your project estimations, to avoid burnout of staff, and to find a product manager who is directly involved and collaborates with your team.
So what we typically do is like we call an analysis spike. So let's not implement it fully, but let's just try if we could do this and make it a really quick and cheap experiment. And we just test. So rather than implementing the whole stack of messages, just start with one, right? And a really simple message and say, is this going to meet our performance? They could have been actually quite quick. Could have been something that we could have done in a day, but rather we spent, I don't know, say 2 months. So that's how you can, save a lot of time and of course money. The other key thing is really getting insights from many different people. So often we all come with our different perspectives, our different backgrounds, we're from different domains and so forth. And so by talking to different people, talking through, having discussions around what that space looks like can be really useful. You're using the wisdom of the crowd rather than just sort of one person.
As code was reviewed and checked in, if you like, as part of the development process, that performance was one of the things that was always on the checklist, to make sure that we understood the performance implications of the code, and like part of the code quality process that we would do anyway.
Inadequate risk management is actually a risk in itself, and this can occur when the risks are not properly recognised and mitigated by all stakeholders from the outset of the project.
A risk is fine until it actually becomes an issue. So basically, it's a supposition to start with, right? So it's even an opinion. Oh, well, we could have some challenges in this space, right? It may or may not take place. You don't necessarily need to mitigate all risks. You can say, well, we're happy to let that one slide for the moment. For whatever reasons, either because it's unlikely to happen or the impact is low. So we can even say, we'll ignore this one, that's fine. It depends a little bit on the risk appetite of the business as well. There's certain constraints that you're working with that aren't always obvious to start with. So what are those constraints? And some of them you can play with, right? Some of them are flexible and others aren't. So it's to know which ones you can play around with and which ones you can't.
What are the repercussions to our company if we are in this business? Because that may restrict who gives us investment. It may restrict which government agencies we can work with, which corporates we can work with. It may have a significant opportunity cost outside of just risk management, because there's risk management and then there's opportunity management. And both of them have a price to pay or to gain, right? And we have to make sure that we evaluate both sides of those. And now we've asked ourselves, is by solving this problem in this way and getting this outcome, is it legal, ethical, acceptable, defendable, sensible that we did it like this with these players in this way? We then have to ask ourselves, does this decision change who we are as a company, especially if there's any misalignment of values or any misalignment in any way around business practices? And secondly, does this change who I am as a person?
Some mitigation strategies for this include including risk in your actual estimations of the software and utilising a risk register on estimations and in the project requirements backlog. Low stakeholder engagement occurs when a client or stakeholder you're collaborating on a project with is not engaging with your team at the frequency necessary to maintain high productivity levels. Low stakeholder engagement is a significant risk to projects because slow responses from the customer can impede delivery timeframes. Some strategies that you can consider include clear agreements with the customer or stakeholders around response times, particularly for any user acceptance testing, and effective selection of delivery and product goals and priorities.
Stakeholder management, I think, is really important and will be a risk to the project if you don't have the right people.
Inadequate human resources is a risk to the project, particularly if knowledge is not adequately documented. Throughout a project, it's therefore valuable to maintain update documentation, onboard new or replacement stakeholders with a learning guide, and monitor the invoice schedule and team utilisation frequently.
That doesn't mean that everyone has to be a superstar team, because that's impossible, but they need to have the right leadership in terms of technical abilities and the right tools to make sure that they go down the track the right way. And I've seen many times where a project development will go down a certain route and it will be some months before people realise that they've made the old mistakes, if you like, that a more experienced person would have been able to give them a hint that they're going down a slightly wrong path. And that creates a lot of rework.
The risk of lack of ownership in software is more about ensuring that there's always someone in the team who's responsible for the software being delivered and accountable for the successes and failures.
Particularly when we want to mitigate risks, I like to define an owner for the action that's related to the mitigation and what they need to do by when. That allows them to be first-class work items, like I was saying. So it's not the same as a story or a task or something, but it should be treated with similar sort of rigor.
Quite often there's a whole team behind us that just never really has that connectivity to customer. And I think it's really important for us to remember that we all have accountability in the chain, and we all need to understand the impact of the tasks that we do every day.
So how do you create this kind of accountability? Some of the strategies we've come up with include setting responsibilities for the stakeholders, having open and clear lines of communication between the stakeholders by valuing transparency and honesty with them, and record or document meetings and action items as they may arise, as well as ensuring user acceptance criteria are completed and approved by a product manager external from the delivery team. We hope this video has helped you identify the 10 big risks in software projects. Obviously, there can be a few more, but it's just important that you can manage them effectively from the outset and throughout the project. My name's Mikaela from Codebots. We hope this video has been helpful for you.